Good afternoon from London. My name is Galin Tikhanov, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you all to this special event dedicated to David Damrosch's book, Comparing the Literatures, Literary Studies in a Global Age. I will be co-chairing this panel with Professor Mats Rosendahl-Thompson, who has kindly agreed to moderate the question and answer session. Before we begin, I wish to thank Delia Ongoriano for her tremendous work in putting this panel together, and also Michael Okrent, who I know is graciously standing by to help if the technology proves too challenging. Thanks also to my seminar students for the rewarding and energizing first session earlier today. The author of this book truly needs no introduction. David Damrosch is the major figure in the field of world literature today, and his knowledge, insight, and energy have been the gift that keeps giving to so many colleagues and students around the world. Amongst the material forms this boundless gift has assumed is the Harvard Institute for World Literature, whose 10th anniversary we're marking this year. Not only is David Damrosch the founding director of the IWL, he is also the person who should be taking the credit for achieving something rare and difficult to attain. David has built over time an institution which hundreds of us can truly call their own. We can do so because of the free spirit of dialogue, collaborative effort, and incisive search for new ideas and perspectives that informs the work of this remarkable center of inquiry. The IWL has been a veritable engine of research, not least through the Journal of World Literature, which arose from within the Institute. But most of all, it has been a place that, even as we meet online, has pulled together people from different generations and cultural backgrounds to create a genuine community of scholars who continue to work together year after year, cultivating an inimitable sense of belonging to the wider IWL family. Together with David, we will have 3 more participants on this panel, and I wish to introduce them here very briefly, because by now they will be known to all of us. I'll do this in the order in which they will make their brief statements. Professor Baidik Bhattacharya of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, Professor Delia Ongoriano of the University of Bucharest and Harvard University, and last but not least, Professor Mats Rosendahl-Thompson, who holds the chair of Comparative Literature at Aarhus University in Denmark. After my colleagues' interventions, David will respond and have the chance to further elaborate on some of the points raised in the interventions before an open question and answer session concludes our work today. All of us on this panel hope that it will become an occasion not just to address David's book, but also, because it is such an important contribution, to enter into a wider conversation, also by encouraging questions from our students and colleagues on the current state of comparative literature and its future. The sheer scope and range of comparing the literatures, the scintillating erudition of its author, an erudition he carries as widely as a straw hat, and the deep commitment to the future of the discipline make this a truly inspirational piece of scholarship. David makes a significant contribution to the field by reviewing the origins, history, principal questions, theoretical foundations, and methodological paradigms, but also the wider intellectual utility of comparative literature, as well as its potential synergies and rivalries with other disciplines in the modern university. The book is the first work to put together on such scale considerations on the evolution and current state of comparative literature by embedding them in masterful microanalyses of individual writers' works and in vivid portraits of thinkers and scholars of relevance to the discipline. All of this is done with an acute sense of the institutional environment and the larger extramural challenges comparative literature faces today. Damrosch moves freely between the anecdotal and the conceptual, adding on occasion valuable insights from his own pedagogical experience. The style is truly engaging. As a matter of fact, long stretches of the book read as a page turner. But this is never at the expense of oversimplification. The stylistic register is rich, ranging as it does from the serious to the witty, to the skeptical, ironical, and consciously melodramatic, a tonality David's mastery of which is unrivaled. A lot in this book will also be of relevance to a wider audience interested in literature more generally, not just comparative literature per se, or in its systematic study as a university discipline. Much of what Damrosch writes has implications for students and scholars of English literature, world literature, post-colonial studies, cultural history, and the list could go on. I have no doubt that this book will soon become a major reference point and that translations will appear in due course, facilitating further crossing of borders. As all excellent books, David's too is bound to generate polemic and give its readers an intellectual incentive to develop further their own perspectives on comparative literature. I'm sure some of this will also be raised during the discussion, but I'm thinking of two questions in particular. One would be the revival of comparative literature. How can one summarize and reflect on what has changed over the last 2 decades that should give us grounds for optimism? There are many challenges, even as we speak, especially the closure of or undermining of modern languages programs across the Anglo-Saxon academe. All of these programs being often vital to the viability of postgraduate research in comparative literature. Next on my list would be the question of the relationship between comparative literature and world literature, epistemologically and institutionally. David has engaged in a seminal way with this question in the past, and it would be good to hear more also on this occasion, especially in the face of the currently widely perceived and painful retreat of globalization. Let me conclude by saying how privileged I feel to have been able to engage with this book. It is a rallying and much needed call for the discipline to be shaped along the lines of methodological pluralism, genuine pluralism, and for different generations of scholars to interact across ideological and aesthetic divides to produce research that enhances the experience of reading and appropriating literature inside and outside of the classroom. With this brief conclusion, it is now a great pleasure to invite Professor Bhattacharya to share his comments. Over to you, Padik.
Thank you, Galen. Thanks a lot. Let me first congratulate David. This book is a terrific achievement in every sense. Its scope, erudition, the range of material it brings together between 2 covers, All of this is simply breathtaking. I have no doubt that this one, like his earlier books, will be a landmark in our understanding of comparative literature as a discipline and also as a way of thinking about literature more generally. I have been reading David's work since my graduate student days at Oxford. I think I first encountered his world literature in 2004 or 5. And like always, I have learned a great deal from this book as well. This also makes my job more difficult. For one thing, I do not want to summarize David's extremely rich and insightful arguments in this book. That will take up all the time I have been allotted as part of this panel. Even if you have read only the introduction and the conclusion, you'll know the drift of the argument and you'll have a fair idea of the range of issues he addresses in this extremely readable and persuasive book. What I'll do instead is that I'll pick up 2 or 3 ideas, or you may say productive tensions in the book, and we'll try to think about their implications for all of us, for people both inside and outside of the disciplinary boundaries of comparative literature. Say someone like me who is not trained in comparative literature. At the heart of this survey of comparative literature as a discipline across the ages, but also particularly for the global age, there lies a central belief. Tweaking Dickens's celebrated opening sentence from A Tale of Two Cities just a little, we may state this belief in the following words. For comparative literature, it is the worst of times, and yet it is the best of times. Yes, the discipline, along with humanities more broadly, is crisis ready. We have had several versions of this crisis narrative in recent past, especially from the so-called global north, leading to what one might call even a crisis industry. And yet, David insists this crisis is also an invitation to rethink the discipline, its premises and presuppositions, as also its future orientation. In fact, he proposes that the current situation offers nothing short of a tectonic shift or a paradigm change, these are his words, an opportunity that comes only once or twice every century. A change of such magnitude, it necessarily follows, needs to be thought through carefully since, again borrowing words from the same sentence of Dickens, such a situation has the possibility of morphing into either the spring of hope or its exact opposite, that is, the winter of despair. David's survey of the discipline and his conclusions are thankfully more springish than winter-like. He states at the outset that the book is conceived as both an anatomy of comparison and as a disciplinary poetics. Again, these are his words. Being both, that is, anatomy and poetics, have different stakes and implications, not always mutually compatible, and he remains extremely responsive to these inherent tensions. The first such tension is visible around 2 ideas addressed across the first 2 chapters of the book: comparison as a method and comparative literature as a discipline. Comparison, or more specifically comparatism, as a method has longer and much more complex history than its disciplinary counterpart. As the first chapter shows, its origins are scattered across locations, histories, and institutions. Its institutionalization since the 19th century is as university disciplines like comparative literature or comparative philology or comparative religion, etc., however, is much more restricted historically and much more direct in its political ambition. David charts out a middle ground to account for different currents and pressures of history by anchoring different ideas in the biography of prominent figures from the late 18th century onwards. First Harrer and Germain de Stael, and then their intellectual inheritor, that is Melville and Posnet. The transition from method to discipline is mediated by their intellectual curiosity and inheritance, as also by their political context and confusion. This initial tension then branches out into further sets that animates much of the remaining chapters. On the one hand, the tension between institutions and individuals, or between what institutions delimit as possible fields and individual attempts to break free of such boundaries. This would include immigrants like Hu Xi and Lin Yutang, alongside more oft-cited figures like Auerbach, Spitzer, or Welleck, or Anna Balakian. This division, and one may add antagonism, only deepened with this division or antagonism between the institution and the individual, only deepened during the Cold War period. Complice, along with area studies, remain mired in political calculation. It is interesting to note that the invasion of theory in the 60s and the 70s, or the crucial questions of language, literature, or comparison in a comparative discipline, are primarily told through individual figures. This brings me to my final point, the location of such arguments, which is institutional and often US complete departments, and what happens to the individual articulation of difference and distinction. To put it differently, how does one rethink the institutional housing of a discipline and the wider world where people read, translate, compare without any institutional context? The way this other one proliferates in the absence of a better term, and also with a nod to our contemporary situation, I'll simply call this viral comparatism. The second one and its future, that is viral comparison and its future, it will be interesting to know David's thoughts on this, the non-institutional viral comparison. I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valdik. And could I now invite Professor Ungoriano?
Thank you so much, dear Galin, and thank you also, David, for providing this great opportunity for us to get together today. I'll try to be brief. I actually timed myself, and if I do go a little longer, my apologies. I hope I'm not going to. The story of David's comparing the literatures is inextricably bound to the story of the past decade of the Institute. Just recently, one of our alumni described the Institute as, quote, a guide through our intellectual journey in a globalizing world. I think comparing the literatures is exactly this. It's a very knowledgeable but also very wise guide, gifted with an amazing sense of humor, always paying attention, exactly like Dante, who happens to be on the cover, to the individual stories that are out there in the world, no matter how different, conflicting, or even challenging to our own prejudices they may be. To me, this is where the heart of the book is. Comparing the literatures stems directly from this 10-year experience of actually doing world literature at the Institute. And in this sense, it's a very lively, and also it's a very real, it's a very authentic book. Many of the ideas that the book puts forth, David explored at length in the opening lectures that he gave every year at the Institute, reflecting always on what still needs to be done, what should be corrected, and how we can improve. Pierre Bourdieu once said that a real theorist's work is never done, but rather always in the making, ready to correct the premises in relation to the findings. Comparing the literatures does exactly this. It allows the literary object to configure its own theory through its locality, be it linguistic, cultural, or theoretical. Beyond the absolutely impressive array of theories and of comparative and world literature discussed in the book, the meta character that towers all is literature in its plural form. Reading David's book, I kind of felt like Virginia Woolf's Orlando and also Clarissa Dalloway, incredibly young, yet unspeakably aged. To quote Orlando, whatever the Dictionary of National Biography may say, some of us are hundreds of years old, though they call themselves 36. It's a book that challenges our received ideas about the field, the practice, and also our object of study, in the most friendly but also erudite manner that establishes a real dialogue with scholars all over the world, and I really mean it, who publish in many of the only 12 languages that David reads. From the major role played by women theorists like Germaine Dostel, Anna Balakian, Barbara Johnson, Lilian First, to the non-Western scholars like Hu Shish and Lin Yutang, people who shaped the discipline, all the way to the thorny problems of politics, language, theory, and comparison, everything is read through its locality in its deepest sense. So the painting on the cover that's called Discussing the Divine Comedy with Dante could very well be rewritten as Discussing the Worlds of Literatures with David Damrosch. Chapter 4 on theories is perhaps my favorite, as it responds to a lingering concern in world literature studies, namely, where do the theoretical structures of thought through which we judge literature come from? Recent years saw a series of criticism from post-colonialism, like Feng Chia's What is a World, or from translation studies like Emily Apter's Against World Literature, both of them arguing that world literature as a discipline still suffers from reading the literature of the world through continental theory. Yet, both Chia and Apter draw in the very books on theoretical support from Heidegger and Derrida. Now, David's inclusive approach in chapter 4 plays brilliantly on testing a pre-modern text, Kalidasa's poem Megaduta, against first, a deconstructivist approach informed by Derrida before turning to what we feel is actually where David's heart really is in the argument, namely to the poetics treatise of the 9th century scholars Anandavardhana and his follower Abhinavagupta. As David argues, and I'm quoting, if theories developed in Paris or Frankfurt are applied by Chinese and American scholars to Brazilian novels or Sanskrit poetry, how much will be distorted or lost altogether in such a triangular trade? With the masterly coup, David practices what others only preach, while arguing, as he's already accustomed us, who know his writing so well for many years now, always for the inclusive approach of the both and rather than the either or. Yet, and this is my question for David, I was wondering what is truly locality beyond its geopolitical and cultural meaning, and whether it really always tells us something about the works physically created in that particular space, and more widely, what is a theory and what qualifies as a theoretical book. Just to think of literature, Gogol's Dead Souls is presented as the most Russian text, and yet it's written entirely in Paris, Rome, Germany, and Switzerland. I was wondering whether locality should not perhaps be individually defined, not only with each writer, but especially with each text. As for instance, I was thinking in my case, not always a theory developed in, for instance, Romania by a theorist of Romanian origin is more relevant for understanding a text written in Romanian than a theoretical text written in another place and also in a different language. As to what qualifies for theory, responses vary not just from culture to culture, but also from one individual to another. Just recently, I had a conversation with a brilliant IWL alumna, Chen Baritsak. She's now a postdoc at Stanford and also the author of a wonderful article on the very problem that was published in the Journal of World Literature. And she was asking me, why is it that Mircea Eliade's work as a theorist of culture is not more widely used? Whereas I replied that, for instance, for me, a theorist is only somebody who has her or his own theoretical system rather than just theoretical ideas that would make one more of an essayist than a theorist. So I was wondering whether, in addition to defining locality individually with every text and every writer, maybe we should also distinguish between different types of theoretical books, like from the hardcore, purely theoretical ones of rhetoric and poetics, all the way to the rather essayistic books that put forth theoretical ideas rather than prescriptive and normative systems. Throughout the book, we find David constantly turning to theoretical works neglected in the Anglosphere world, and this is an amazing takeaway of this book. One of the things that really is so admirable about David's work in general is its organicity. And just recently, following his own observations in the book on the need to expand our theoretical canon beyond the US and the European one, he's just submitted a proposal to Princeton University Press for a book series in which to include key works for comparative and world literature that have not or have only been partially translated or are currently out of print, books that his own book is drawing on. And these names would include women like Germaine de Stel, all the way to Pascal Casanova's last book, and including very important theorists like René Etiamble, but also Dionys Duchin and also Chan Jongshu. Great at practicing what he preaches, David situates his own position in the field through his own biography. And I think we should all follow this example in our work more. Not just a genuine dialogue with a great variety of theorists, as numerous as the 100 characters in the Chinese painting on the cover, David's book is written in a style in which we recognize David's own heroes, the erudite ironists Rabelais and Joyce, and the self-reflective Montaigne. We may learn new things about ourselves reading this book, while at the same time keeping young in the field, a lesson that I myself first learned from the surrealist poet Andre Breton, and then I was very happy to find it again in David's new book, that I have absolutely no doubt is just as revolutionary as what is world literature that established the discipline. David's book teaches us to be very self-reflective, but also to listen and to see more and talk less, which reminds me that I should also put this into practice as we speak and listen more and turn the floor to Mads. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Delia, very much indeed. And I'm very, very happy to hand over now to Professor Mads Rosendahl Thompson.
Thank you, and thank you so much for organizing this. And it's great to have an opportunity to talk about a book. We should do that more, and in particular about books that so richly deserves it, like comparing the literatures. It's hard not to see this book in the light of what is the word literature from 2003, which had a relatively new comeback, not just due to David, but of course with David playing a major role in the new interest in world literature. I think that it also is a sequel to that book that has the same concern for the discipline as such of comparative literature. Was the provocation perhaps back in 2003 was, why was there so much Henry James and Balzac and so little else in comparative literature? So where that book was very much about establishing the right for a different comparative space of thinking about comparison in different ways, it has succeeded in a way that you don't argue so much about bringing up world literature. And it's only apt to then turn back to the larger discourse of comparative literature and think about what does that discipline mean now. It's also a very generous book. It doesn't take victory laps, but it celebrates the joy of transformation of the discipline. And it does so by really acknowledging, in particular, the accomplishments of younger generations. And really, you feel the joy of saying, well, yeah, there's so much good work being produced by following new paths that weren't so obvious 2 decades ago. So death of a discipline, not so fast. There's also a lot of joy of telling in the book. And I think the 3 other presenters has already hinted at that. I mean, it really goes into showing how much circumstances shape the way that people think about things, how discourses are not just created in a vacuum, but that there is a context to that. And I think that one of the merits of the book is rather than pick contemporary battles, it really shows how you can learn from previous situations and battles, and how they were formed and how they transformed and how they linked into each other, and how we can reap some of the benefits from that and not think so much about battles, but really what came out of that. And also it continues famously, what is world literature gives 3 definitions of world literature very shrewdly. So you couldn't be hung up on one definition, but there are 3 complementary, and where you had a lot of thoughts to do about thinking, do they really complement each other just flawlessly, or is there something that falls out? And that has been very productive, at least to me. And I think the commitment to pluralism, which is of course a difficult thing to commit to. I mean, often people, they can establish careers by saying, well, we have to go this direction. This is what is true. And where you both structure the book very deftly with the origins, immigration, politics, theories, languages, literatures, world comparisons, but also has this pluralistic mindset throughout the book. And both in comparing the literatures, but also in the foreword to the new edition of Anatomy of Criticism by Arthur Fry, there's a reference to sort of that there's no sorrow in the way that there's no Archimedes point from which we can observe all of literature, or where we can move the world from just one point. So the commitment to pluralism is also very important. Now I'll move into something that I'm then curious about, and would like you to address, David, in whatever form you may find relevant. And 2 groups of questions. One would be about context and text balance. I mean, how do you write on a subject? That's one of the things that you're interested in, because the book is, you could say, it's a meta study. It's about the discipline, and it has a lot of heroes and lots of ways of thinking about what can you do. And of course, the easy way out would be say, well, there's lots of things you can do. You can do digital humanities and distant reading. You can do close reading. You can do comparative, this or that. But you come away with the idea of, well, is there something where you say, well, this is where really where the discipline works at its best? And perhaps even more importantly, for whom should it work? I mean, what is the different audiences we address now? There's also this commitment to saying we can't just write for each other, as professors write a book for each other, but who do we actually address later on? The second question, and I think that's the villain of the book, but also the new challenge that you see both in the introduction and also lurking throughout the book, is sort of the war against presentism. How do we cultivate an environment of reading across times, where you could say that the challenge of what is world literature was a geographical cultural challenge, that we were reading too narrowly in a geographical sense. The world was not big enough. Now it's not long enough. We don't go far enough back in time. So the question is, how do we create a new comparative space, if that's the same challenge, but which also sort of takes into account the temporal neglected dimension of literature? And to throw a softball, I mean, you describe yourself in the beginning as a recovering structuralist. And also with the forward to Anatomy of Criticism, Fry's magistral work, I think it's interesting if a direction in creating a new comparative space would have to do with learning from structuralism, or promoting the ideas of a structuralist poetics that could somehow create a vehicle of framing, of saying we don't want to read out of context, but there is things that we can learn, and we can sort of build on introducing works and working with works across time that has to be founded in a rejuvenation of structuralist poetics, which of course shouldn't be the same as the 60s or the 80s and so on, but should have its own contemporary design. And finally, a very small note, there's this beautiful cover, and which is also repeated, just like in what is world literature, of the gathering of enormously great group of people that you would like to have a conversation with. And I think it's a beautiful contrast where you have, in what is world literature, a few people trying to figure out what is the things the archaeologists working in Egypt. And then with this larger conversation that takes place. And I think somehow that's a fitting image that was the opening of a conversation that actually came into being with 100 people, pretty much as we are here, represented on that cover of this beautiful, so learned and so interesting book.
Thank you, Mats. Thank you very much indeed. And many thanks to all my fellow panelists for their interventions. Before I invite David to respond to these comments, let me show you the cover that Mats was talking about, which is a truly lovely cover. I hope you can see it. Yeah. Good, thank you, and David, it's your turn. We're greatly looking forward to your engagement with this.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this all too generous set of comments and suggestions. A lot of interesting thoughts here, and some recurrent patterns. Of course, as a comparatist, we can compare the different comments. And particularly, I mean, Vaidik talking about the tension between the institutional and the individual, which also goes to what would be a vital comparison beyond the institutions, which also goes to Maz's question of who's our audience beyond the immediate locality. Delia's very interesting comment about the role of the institute here. And indeed, I might say that at the beginning of, in the acknowledgements to the What is World Literature book, I say I have 1,000 people to thank, which was the ACLA. And so very much that book came out of the experience of developing working with the American Comparative Association, developing the pattern of seminars that we have now with ACLA, which then led to also helped inspire our institute. The Vaidik's question about the institutional versus the individual, and Delia's comment about, there are certain, I clearly have certain heroes who tend to be individual. So the structuralist in recovery is also kind of American individualist of a certain formation, a certain background, a white bourgeois individualism, I suppose, that I also, I celebrate and have gotten, a amount of feedback back in the earlier book about, as though the individual author can just cross borders reasonably easily, and that's what's worth celebrating. And the question of pluralism that more than one of you has mentioned is also, of course, susceptible to the same kind of tendentiousness, with perhaps the added problem that it can be masked, because, well, if I'm a pluralist, is that then the way we should all go? That doesn't admit that that's what it's doing, right? So if I would critique my own sort of comments, so those various people who said the discipline has to be my way all along, am I not doing that in my own way also? So part of this, I think, is, as Maz said, this book is very much reflecting back on the experience that led to the What is World Literature book, and these experiences since. And indeed, and Pascal Casanova talks in the preface to the revised edition of the World Republic of Letters, a revised French edition, which we've now published, just now is out in the Journal of World Literature, in that special issue that is co-edited with Gisèle Sapiro on the legacy of Casanova. She talks about the fact that once her book came out, suddenly and it started to get translated and discussed around the world, she found herself part of the same process she had theorized. She herself became a character. What she said was it was an abîme étrange et troublante. She's sort of a mise en abîme. And of course, this, if I'm reflecting from what you said, I haven't really thought about it in the same way before. The What is World Literature book came out of being in a department of English and Comparative Literature, which was primarily an English department at Columbia, but also very heavily inflected globally by the presence of Edward Said. And indeed, in my own case, just to speak a moment autobiographically, the sort of random chance of where I studied and then where I got a job took me from the Yale of Paul de Man to the Columbia of Edward Said, which is a little bit head-spinning change. Not even so much that Said was in such a different world as that his students were really in a different world, and often we'd be working with the same students. So the people he would attract, a younger generation, edgier than Edward himself, more really radical in many ways, very, very different from the world of textuality of at least a sort of dominant mode at Yale at that time. Although, as I was noting in the introduction, that I was also interested in ancient Near East, and Mesoamerica gave me different kinds of empires than the ones that are usually discussed in different kinds of material culture. So it was partly that, and then working with ACLA for a long time, as I did a lot in the years leading up to What is World Literature, was partly because I was not that much at home institutionally in an English department at Columbia. So I had to kind of invent a virtual institutional life for myself. So hooking onto ACLA and then pushing it to start having our first meetings outside of the US, to become more global, and a different mode of work, the seminars, that meant people would really collaborate more, and becoming much more internationalized. When I was first involved with ACLA, it was almost entirely just Americans coming, very rarely people coming from abroad. Now there might be 50 countries represented typically. And that was a big deal for me to sort of be involved with that. But up to that time, I was doing a British anthology, and by the time I published the What is World Literature, I hadn't spent very much time outside the US. And unlike most comparatives, or many comparatives, not only was I not an emigre, but I wasn't really fluent in any other language, and this sort of, claim to be able to read some other languages with, increasing incompetence, not only from one to another, but over time. It's so partly I had not the luxury of a strong base in another language, another culture, and teaching an English department was not giving me that either. And I thought when I came up to Harvard 10 years ago, oh, now at last I'll get to teach in the original language much more. But I found, no, people are basically using translations a lot in complex courses because you can't assume that everyone knows even one common language, like French, the way you could before. So this is just to say that, very too long, but I think with the What is World Literature was also about me thinking about, all right, how do I get out of a rather circumscribed institutional setting? And then suddenly I start giving talks around the world, and 40 or 50 countries, almost entirely after that first book. And now suddenly I'm thrown out there and realizing how American I am after all. Casanova talks about that in her preface. She found when she started giving talks abroad and her book was being read abroad, she discovered she was French, which she never thought she was before. She thought she was anti-French. And then she realized it's a little bit like James Baldwin, when black meets brown encounters on the Seine. So I too, discovered that I was far more American, far more Anglo, far more white male than I like to think of myself. And then thinking about that. So I do think institutionally for me, I put a lot of stress in small groups working together. So the seminar formed with the ACLA and then ADUL, and especially the colloquia that come out with it. My utopian hope is that it is an interaction among different perspectives in a room extensively together, maybe the best way to break out of our own individual box, which we otherwise inevitably are largely inside. And that may even include being inside the pluralistic box. And it's a kind of an American luxury of a certain class, a certain formation, certain resources to think you can afford a certain kind of pluralism. That means you dabble in a bunch of different languages, a bunch of different periods, all that kind of opportunity, but it's also limitation. So this is just to say that very much, I think the What is World Literature book was a product of actually sort of 20 years. I got my PhD in 1980, and I didn't know what the hell I was going to do with my interests. I had these various interests. I knew I had this, some interest in English literature, European literature, this Mesoamerican interest, ancient Near Eastern literature, but I didn't want to end up being 1/3 each of 3 different specialists, just evaporating. But I didn't know what to do. And I thought, well, if I just somehow think for 20 years, maybe I'll find a way to put it together. And it was to the semester 20 years after I started teaching, 2000, that I, having done a British anthology for a long when my editor said, well, let's do a world literature anthology. So I signed this contract and I said to myself, what the hell is world literature? And I thought, well, that might make a good title, which I shortened slightly for Princeton. But it was really coming out of that period when the world was largely theoretical for me, having never lived abroad for any length of time, beyond like a summer in graduate school, and not had a lot of experience except the world coming in. So now this book, essentially, if we did periodize like that way, that was 1980 to 2000, I started writing that book in 2003. This book comes out of the last 20 years, 2000 to 2020. Almost, you can see the Trojan War, Odysseus in the background, probably a certain periodicity there. And it very much has to do with the stimulating shock of encountering so many different institutional formations in different places, and not just the institution per se, but its cultural political valences. So, what does it mean? Chulalongkorn University and its particular history versus the other universities in Bangkok. What does it mean? I talk about this in the book, that comparative literature looks very different at La Sapienza than the University of Milan, completely different, more different than anyone would think who thinks there is some Western form of comparative literature, and particularly more different than any American would think who doesn't read any goddamn Italian scholarship, and it is amazing to me. The Americans tend to be so myopic, so provincial in not reading any other scholarship unless it's been translated in English or in the particular language they may specialize in. So plenty of, Emily after will read plenty of French criticism in French, but beyond that, she's not going to read the Italian stuff. She could, but she doesn't, right? And that's what's so striking about it. And that was true of myself, true of many of us. So I do think that the impetus to think, including the sort of intensity of a culturally, politically engaged comparative world literature study everywhere other than the United States is much greater, which has that pro and con, the advantage and disadvantage of the closer connection to the national culture, a closer sense of audience, and also it tends to pull inwards towards my country and either its colonial heritage or a couple of other countries, and much less transversal work than one might have. And that has been easier in America, partly because of the weakness of American studies within the United States, which leads, and Michael and our fellow group at Harvard have been talking about this in the era of Black Lives Matter. Do Black Lives Matter in comparative literature? Does indeed anything about American culture matter in comparative literature? Renee Willock famously said in his book in his essay on the crisis of comparative literature, well, comparative literature has been thriving in America partly because America's literature has so little to boast of itself. So we're freer to talk about the rest of the world. That was not such an advantage, right? So that we in the United States have a lot of work to do to really connect to our culture in a way I think compared to most other places, that's more of a given. And then there's more of a reciprocal challenge to not only be serving the immediate needs of the immediate audience. So who are we writing for is very much a question. And how do we write for people? And I think that this book, picking up on this idea that Mads is saying that it was more geographical challenge 20 years ago, now it's more temporal. But of course, this was always the theme for me. I mean, I made a point of putting this ancient Egyptian or the modern Europeans trying to deal with ancient Egypt on the cover of the earlier book, and the Egyptian chapter or the chapter on Mechtel von Magdeburg, very important to me. I note, incidentally, that and people who've talked about my book almost never talk about the earlier chapters, the chapters based on earlier literature. It's as though they aren't there for most people, which is also frustrating because those tend to be the chapters I'm most talking about the cultural political setting, though also I have a chapter on Rigoberta Menchú. So you get these sort of interesting claims that I'm not interested in history because I'm just like the structuralist, or just like this liberal American who thinks history doesn't matter. But then people don't read the chapters that are more historically grounded. Though that too suggests that history itself is not one thing, just as indeed theory is not one thing, as Deleuze was saying. What is historicity? What historicity? What is history? What is history of a text? And how do we engage with that? So this book is partly definitely looking back 20 years to the origins of the previous book, and also trying to correct or resituate for a changed cultural political circumstance. So that in 2000 to 2002, when I was writing that book, there's a lot of emphasis on translation as a positive thing, as a doable thing, because I'm reacting against my own formation 20 and 30 years before, when you weren't supposed to use translations. You're supposed to read only the original. If you did use a translation, you wouldn't admit it, which also meant you hardly read anything beyond a very small number of languages. And no one was reading beyond a very small number of languages. We're now in a much better situation with that, in that we now have many more languages being studied. I was mentioning in my seminar today, we have a student now doing her PhD dissertation in my department. She's Polish, Hispanist, and she's working on Spanish and Catalan and Basque and Quiche, Mayan and Nahuatl. And she's actually goes and studies these languages, and she's working like a Mayan novel that's never been translated. And she's intensely aware of the problems of translation. It's not an easy matter. The borders, the barriers are very high, and the writers she's writing about make this a prime theme. It's not a easy, liberal, neoliberal world. This goes back to the question of what is location, who you're writing for. The Mayan author who makes a point of writing a novel in Quiche, which will have almost no readership, it's like Gugiwatiango, only even more so, is making a certain cultural political choice and a certain artistic choice that is very admirable and honorable, but then also needs Matilda Figueroa, who can mediate this for readers who will never be able to read it, and or needs translation. So one of my emphases these days is very much that we have to be much more activist, and it goes back to the question also of audience, in getting literature into people's hands. When we can't just assume that the humanities provides enough course assignments, course enrollments to just keep things in print. We have to be activists. We have to do things on the web. We have to get things translated. We have to be doing this work ourselves. We have to put our effort there. And I do think with the problem of language, we have to work more collectively because we can't learn enough languages. I tried and I failed completely, even to study the ones I've studied adequately. So it needs different modes of collective work. So I think those are probably some basic comments, and I'd be happy to have more pushback or more and more complaints and questions from you and the panelists or from the gang. So, but Baidak, I'm wondering, you've been very generous, but reading the book, you think, oh yeah, Damrosch says, has a few pages, but hasn't really gotten the point.
No, not at all. See, in my book, I address this question through what I call the Trinity of world literature, which is basically Casanova, Moretti, and you. And
now I am a preacher's kid, so the Trinity is very meaningful to me, but it seems like a bit of an exaggeration.
For many of us, for instance, who are completing our dissertations in early 2000s, this is how the field came to be. I mean, this is how we access the field, through your work, through Moretti's intervention, through Casanova's work, which was being translated. I didn't know about her when I was doing my PhD, but once the book was available in English, it was a major part of our English literature discussion as well. Because I'm not trained in comparative literature, I'm trained in English literature departments. So that way, it was a kind of entry point through the three of you. And you are probably the only one who has made an effort to engage with areas which are not traditionally part of comparative literature departments in the US context. This is the question I also wanted to ask. There is an interesting argument, because we are also discussing your work today in my seminar, your first chapter from What is World Literature, and the supplementary reading was your conversation with Spivak. Where there is an interesting tension between the two of you when you were interacting. The institutional location comes back so strongly in your response to what Spivak says, is something I wanted to push you a little farther on. What exactly is the institutional context if we take it outside of the US? For instance, in my experience in India, for instance, there are very few comparative literature departments, only a handful. But what has actually happened is that English departments have transformed themselves into comparative literature departments. So if you look at the PhDs which are coming out of English departments, they're not on traditional British literature. They're comparing all sorts of Indian literatures which they can access in their original languages, in their original texts. They're doing a comparative study, but under English literature department. In fact, in my experience, there are very few dissertations which are on British literature or the canon of British literature. Mostly literature from other regions like the Caribbean or Australia and different parts of India in different languages. So I was wondering about this institutional location. If you push it a little farther out of the US context, how do you think is the future of comparative literature would look like?
Yeah, my guess is that that's, to me, on the positive side very much, that these walls have been really breaking down between natural literature to comparative literature, and that any serious study of global Anglophone or English literature is a comparative study. And indeed, it's all the better when someone who knows Tamil can then bring in Tamil and English. It was already Amiya Dev 30 years ago was saying you should have a comparative Indian literature. And I think now it's actually starting to happen. And as you say, not so much within the very few departments like Jadavpur of comparative literature, although there are, I think, a few more now than there were, like Hyderabad and a couple of others, but primarily through other departments. And I think my dream would be that every department would have a comparative or a world dimension. When I came up to Harvard, and it was Steve Owen was then the chair and was pressing the department to start to think more globally and less purely, largely European. And in his own life was a bit of a revenge, because when he finished his undergraduate studies, really knowing quite a number of languages, including Welsh, and being brilliant with Chinese, he wanted to study comparative literature, and he was told, no, sorry, you can't apply to the Complet department at Yale because we don't do Asia. So just go to East Asian Studies. So then the repressed returns as chair of the department at Harvard and makes it go. At the same time with Steve Owen, I will say, one of the reasons why I became a comparativist was because he scared me away from Chinese studies. As a freshman, I took a course in Chinese literature and translation with him, with this young, brilliant, he was like 25, and just an assistant professor. And it was fantastic. And he was doing the translation, he had these amazing diagrams of how Dufu poems would work. And he had some graduate students sitting on the class, but a continual theme was that they had it wrong, they had it wrong, they had it wrong. And it's like, you could only begin to understand, an 8-line poem by Dufu if you spent 30 years. I thought, that's nice. I'm not going to do that. Can't do that. So I do feel that, and Sheldon Pollock has complained about this too, that like Sanskritists often say, why aren't more people reading Sanskrit? But then they've put so many barriers around the field, they're not inviting people in. And he has an interesting, I talked about in the book, he was saying this, a whole sort of forum that he gets going on people working in early pre-modern material and getting people from different fields to look at this history of Indian literature. And they're all writing to say, well, this is nice, but I don't know what you're talking about. You haven't written this in a way that could be understood outside your small group. So I think we all have this concern. One of my side interests has been Old Norse, and it's very much the case in Icelandic studies. The Icelandicists write for each other, and then they wonder why they don't have an audience. So I would like to hope that all of us would find ways for reaching out from our location, institutionally, personally, and the base of material we really know, towards this wider world. And I should say that for me, this strategy in this book of building around people's biographies, these mini biographies of people, was partly, it was my editor at Princeton at that time, when I was starting this book, and I published this book called Meetings of the Mind, which is quasi-novelistic Platonic dialogues. And my editor then said, well, why don't you put your two selves together with the next book? Talk about actual people, and as long as the theories. Now, I thought that was a great idea, because so many of these surveys of the discipline that there were quite a lot of, like in the 70s and 80s, they're very earnest and they're really boring. You fall asleep after a few pages. And so I thought my first plan for this book was try to keep you from falling asleep. And this goes back to the question, who are you writing for? It's a wonderful thing if we actually learn how to write for people who aren't being paid to read us. And in a way, the stresses of the humanities forces us to think, if we're going to publish at all, let's think of how to write. The other side of this is my beloved older brother, the older of my two brothers, Leo, retired now some years ago, professor of 18th century English literature. In his later years, just got sick of writing for the small group of 18th century English literature specialists, all of whom were each other's throats most of the time. And he started writing for a general audience. And he had learned from one of his mentors, Jackson Bate, that the best way to get a general audience is biography. People aren't necessarily that much interested in literature itself, but they'll be interested in the lives of the writers. So he has done a series of biographies with great success. And I thought this was really interesting. And indeed, along with this, think of for audience, the other book to mention here is the Buried book that I wrote in the wake of, so the one that came after What is World Literature, in the wake of 9/11. I got so annoyed about this stupid discourse in the United States about a clash of civilizations. I thought, well, that's not helpful. What do I know something about that the world needs to know about that shows if you go back far enough, there's one civilization that then takes various, first, Epic of Gilgamesh. The world needs a book on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this would be like a good example of how do you write about something very specialized for an audience that doesn't know what cuneiform is, that couldn't locate Assyria on a map. And not only the current president of the United States couldn't do that, but many people could not do that. So I thought, all right, let me tell this story as an archaeological dig, going from the present back to this more obscure past, do a reverse chronology. And of course, you know, Times Arrow, there are a couple of Pinter, a couple of models for that. And so I make this thing, and I go to start to talk to some trade publishers, and I find these amazing letters unpublished by these early archaeologists, very dramatic stories. All right, now I have material that could actually be of interest to the general public. And I go and I'm shopping it around, and the one I went with, the publisher gave me a hard time. He looks at the opening page and say, when this guy Smith discovers these tablets, is the most exciting discovery in history of 19th century archaeology. It led to his career. And he taps it with his pencil and said, "This is nice, but couldn't you make it just a bit more dramatic?" I thought, okay, now I'm learning, right? So you'll see here, and it's a profession. It's a challenge, and it probably warps the book towards good stories about people's lives. But that's a principle of selection, like any other, and it is warped towards people I identify with. So, you know, I'll have a chapter like the one on languages, and I thought, well, language is very important, complex. It's been discussed in every one of these books. It's not that interesting in itself. Yes, you should learn more language. Yes, it's hard. So what? So then, you know, I start thinking, and I really connected this Etienne, who again was someone I'd barely ever read before. So that chapter starts, in the months leading up to his 4th birthday, René Etienne lost his father and discovered world literature. There he is in his attic as a working class kid. He gets fascinated by the T.L. and Nawat, which connects to me because that was something that fascinated me too. And so I start from there. And I think having that kind of hook means you're being selective in a way that is, it's not necessarily theoretically justifiable. You're partly going where the stories are, but also any of us who works in early material knows you're going to have to do that. Like with the Buried book, I have a lot on the Assyrian Empire because Ashurbanipal's library has all these cuneiform tablets. I would have loved to have had stuff on the Babylonian libraries. They all disappeared. And Venkat Mani has talked about, a lot about archives and libraries. And so you have to go to these few places that are illuminated because you've got sources, whereas you don't other places. And those of us who work in earlier periods, that's a perennial problem. So it's a distortion, or it's shaping to what you've got.
Questions are coming in, and in short, I'll try to weave 2 questions into this. One is very concrete. Says, would not narratology be very helpful for disciplinary poetics? Why not? Why is it not so common in the understanding of world literature to use comparative narratology as a supplementary discipline? What kind of structuralism of poetics are you referring to? How can we use narrative theory? And another one asks, very much in line with this, what should be some of the principles of a poetics of comparative literature be?
Big questions. So the narratology, which was so important in the 70s and in Complete very much, Jeanette, very, very important. And indeed, I mean, in Jonathan Culler bringing in structuralist poetics. Peter Brooks, another of my teachers, reading for the plot, really thinking narratologically and combining with theory. I think that remains incredibly vital. Brooks is one of the people to whom I dedicate this book. In fact, it was wonderfully useful that way. The narratological question is very much then, I think, open for whole new reinvention, because that older narratology was so much based on a Western European canon. And it was really very, very French-centered. And, so Tsvetan Todorov would also talk about Boccaccio. Then he has a book on the conquest of America that fails because he didn't really, he's just projecting European ideas. So now I think a narratological discussion, whether of the novel, of epic, is wide open. And this is one reason why in this Daily Mentions hoping to get Princeton to this series. Among the books would be Echamba's book, Ouverture vers Comparatisme Planétaire. And there, in the 80s, Echamba's already saying this, and he has his essays there and in several of his other books. And he talks about the novel and says, how can you possibly talk about the novel if you only read Tolstoy and Proust? You have to also read the Genji. Even if you're reading in translation, you've got to do that. And I think so narratology, it'd be striking, it is now striking to think of how to do that outside a particular localized archive for which the theories develop, which always means, and I think it's fine to use these European theories abroad, but then the material should always push back against the theory and affect it, as with the Kalidasa example. We can actually interchange, intersperse. If you just have Derrida, or if you just have Anandavardhana, you're missing something. If you have both of them, then you have different aspects, and Derrida can help you see what Anandavardhana wants to wish away, wants to regularize, wants to systematize, which is actually very interesting. So you can say that a French structuralist poetics counterposed with a Sanskrit poetics, the two systematicities can have interference with each other in a way that one system is not going to be that helpful. So I think that may be the second part. Maybe by confronting these different systematicities as well as different archives, then we actually get an opening up of narratology and of poetics.
Then there are a group of questions that has to do with the organization of comparative literature departments. There's one from Marcel Strobel from Santa Barbara. As a first-year student, first-year PhD student in the program of comparative literature, I struggle to determine to which department I truly belong, especially when talking to peers in traditional departments such as English. What is, in your opinion, on comparative literature? What is your opinion on comparative literature as a discipline tied to a department versus comparative literature as a method tied to a program? Also, how does queerness play into the traditional notion of comparative literature from a 2020 perspective? And if I can tie one to that, that's one of our seminar leaders, Venkat Mani, who also says that he echoed all the lavish praise and adulation extended by the esteemed panelists. Comparing the literatures announces both the necessity and the productivity of comparing across space and time. I have much to say about this, but in the interest of time. And his first comment or question is that colleagues have mentioned the benefits of the book for English and comparative literature departments. And I want to add that the book is very much also an invitation to the so-called national literature departments and area study centers in the US to reflect on their anatomy and poetics, which is increasingly comparative, as you also state. And finally, you could say really sort of the broad question raised by two other questionnaires. I mean, how should we think of the perennial questions of conflicts? What should they answer? And how do you see the broader institutional change in the future? Will there be literature departments with combined national departments that are organized by methodology rather than nation state and language in the future?
So when I came up to Harvard 10 years ago and the department was reorganizing itself, the question came up, should comparative literature still be the name of the department or not? Maybe think of a world literature, and there are now some world literature departments and programs that are being established different places, including some cases by people who've been associated with our institute. I felt, and the group overall felt, that comparative literature is fine as the name of the discipline, as an institutional structure. World literature is more of a kind of a framing device, I think, than it is a discipline per se, so that one can think of a given work within a world literature context. When I was writing about the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, it was a single text. That would not have been my teacher's comparative literature. It's not being compared to anything. It is moving out into the world. It's being framed in a world way. And I think that for, say, English departments or area studies departments or German departments, maybe comparative literature is a framing device in the way that world literature is for complet, or indeed world literature can be a framing device, as Vaidik was saying, for Anglophone studies. So that I think it's very much a matter that comparison is, as we know, a fundamental part of the way the mind works. And I think comparative literature as a discourse, as a framing discourse, that's, I think, be good for everybody to know some of this history, to know some of this discourse. In much the same way it's good for everyone working in one literature to know at least one other language. You have a frame for that. And I think that it's not that important. Well, the stress on the humanities overall is likely to mean many fewer departments of individual literatures and perhaps of literature at all. I think comparative literature, comparative study is going to be interfusing increasingly, as several of the panelists have already noted, a lot of what we do. And I think that's all to the good. There is a certain amount of anxiety sometimes expressed that, oh, comparative literature will be eating up these struggling smaller national literature departments. And I think deans sometimes have that in mind too. I don't think we comparatists should particularly be enthusiastic about that at all. We have at Harvard a department of Romance languages that had been Spanish, a separate department. For 20 years they've been together and they're still not getting along. So I don't think it helps to do that on a global scale, but whatever institutional form works for a given place, my utopian idea is that comparatism is something that everyone becomes alive to, and is just part of what we can do. The question of queerness is, I think, bound up with all these patterns of older normativities that were sort of left to the side, and I think increasingly coming to the fore. That goes to the question of identity and what we're studying when we're studying a writer. I think that D.A. Miller had this nice small book called Bringing Out Roland Barthes, and this was around 1980, I suppose. And this was after it was bound together with a publication of Barthes' journals or diaries that had not been published in his lifetime. And Miller talks about the fact that in that old structuralist heyday of the 70s, late 60s and 70s, Barthes' sexuality was basically never discussed in the complet department. It was all narratology. SZ was just discussed in terms of, and SZ of all texts was just discussed in terms of the hermeneutic code and the proairetic code. And it's open that the Barthes book is pushing against easy definitions of sexuality and essentially transgender studies before there was such a transgender study. And it was completely invisible in comparative literature at the time. And even studies of Proust, I mean, remarkably rarely would you see really about, I mean, Proust in The Art of Love is like, it's not really getting into sexuality in a certain way. And Virginia Woolf, to take that example of, Orlando is completely marginalized. And even within Mrs. Dalloway, I mean, the kiss with Sally Seton, it's not what it was about, So in that sense, the queerness is sort of like Edward Said pointed out, that the imperialism was never discussed in Victorian studies, Jane Austen and so on. There are all of these things in these texts that a certain kind of normativity of a sort of melting pot common denominator missed. And I think so that also comparative studies can also help us think of sexualities in a much more interesting way, and also can help push back against whatever is the current discourse of sexuality where one is, which is always bounded in certain ways. And if we open our archive, that gives us a different option. Let me just say about the lingering structuralism, and this came with my seminar in the previous 2 weeks. It seems to me perhaps the most mixed blessing of structuralism is the love of binary oppositions. It's so well-grounded, so sûr, it's so opening out, it's so exciting, but also it can get routinized into an either or. And of course, to say, well, I'm a both and kind of guy rather than either or kind of, is still an opposition. It's a structuralist binary. But I hope that we can move more, and I think we more than ever need to move beyond the reification of oppositional discourses, which in quite a few countries, and especially in America now, is just intellectually harming everybody who buys into a simplistic polemic. It's a little bit better that you get these holy trinities, and you had, you know, Said, Spivak, Homi Bhabha. There's something about the mind that seems to like a group of three like that, and maybe we could have 4 or 5 or 6, not just always default back to some trinity in that same way. So I hope also that a comparative perspective in a given location can a little bit open out that Trinitarian or that structuralist binarism that seems to be so widespread and almost invisible to us a lot of the time.
There are a few more questions. I have 2 which are more political, and I have a couple which are more into the methods of the discipline. So let's take the 2 more political questions. For Sinja Vranjes, dear David, congratulations on your book. One issue has been troubling me lately, and it is connected to the question of historical political context. How do you think the rise of the right-wing movements throughout the world will affect the study of humanities, and more particularly the study of world literature? And related to that, Venkat Mani asks, extending the relationship between anatomy and poetics and the public sphere comparison. I read your book with very much as one that centralizes and celebrates migration, willful and forced as a phenomenon that impacts and encourages comparison per se, and the construction of complete as a discipline. Do you think that the worldly orientation of comparative literature as a discipline and the neglect of the local American literature that was eye-opening for me from the beginning may have impacted somehow the neglect, or at least a comparative lack of centralization of racial divisions in the US Academy? Would you talk a little bit more about this, given the current situation and the ongoing conversation on both anti-immigrant public sphere and the renewed reflection of race issues on US campuses?
It's very much on our minds these days. I do think that the rise of the radical right in a lot of places, which often tends to be associated with kind of ethno-nationalism, make America white again, essentially. We seem to see Donald Trump saying, just to give that example, is something that we need to combat and need to find creative ways to combat that. I think we have an urgent mission. And if the mission of comparatists after World War II is to try to put Europe back together and help nations speak to each other and have harmony, I think our mission is very much trying to think about keeping the world from falling apart into these aggressive ethno-nationalist contexts. This also involves, I think, thinking very, very hard about how we position ourselves in relation to the discourse where we are, and it means both with our students, and I think also we have to do more than some of us have felt we had to do of intervening online and in newspapers, and really we just have to be political actors here. On the question of racial division, especially in the United States, is something, as Michael knows, we've been discussing in the department, and these questions of why there are so few African Americans, for example, in comparative literature in the United States, and why ethnic studies in general has been marginalized in the US context. And I'll be interested as whether there are equivalents or not elsewhere. But the question of language has been a very serious one. In my view, a lot of this has to do with institutional sorting mechanisms, where comparative literature in the United States, and I think elsewhere, with its philological roots, always made a point you should be able to read 3 languages to come to graduate school in comparative literature. That was required. And indeed 3 languages apart from English, at least claim to be able to read pretty soon. Like that. Whereas in ethnic studies in the United States, it tended to be monolingual or bilingual, but if you're doing Latinx, you're really doing Spanish and maybe English, but not more languages like that. And if you're doing African American studies, you were usually monolingual. Native American studies, English plus maybe 1 native language, rarely even comparative across other native languages. So this meant that an undergraduate interested in ethnic studies would not apply to a graduate program in comparative literature, and if they did, they wouldn't be accepted. Just like Steve Owen knew too many languages, was interested in languages, not the few favorite one, whereas the bright young student interested in African American literature did not know enough languages. So they would go towards American Studies, Ethnic Studies department, or English departments. So it's a structural basis that is, I think, is not structural racism, but structural philologism has kept a lot of people out of comparative literature. And I think here again, there's still a strategic value today for comparative literature to emphasize multilingualism. And in particular, in a world of migration, it's a safe space for multilingualism. And we really, really, really need that. It should be the voice of multilingualism. But then comparative studies should exist also in ethnic studies departments, in American studies departments, in Tamil studies departments, in Romanian studies departments, in Slavic departments. And I think we have a lot of work to do, but a lot of possibility to open up bridges across these divides. If we no longer fetishize comparative is what does 4 languages, ethnic studies is what does what's happening politically in 1 language.
Ian Howe asks, after praising your book, by the way, and saying he has read it, that you're tracing comparative literature to comparative philology as a disciplinary historical way. It's very important, but we know, as the origin of modern humanities, philology has been recalled in our literature studies, especially in literature theory today. You also mentioned Pollock's world philology. Let me associate it with world literature. But your Harvard colleague, Jan Shilovsky, 2005, criticized jambalaya philology studies as metaphilology, hypophilology, and pseudo-philology. What's your methodological difficulties in world literature studies on philological view? Only the language problem? And can we connect traditional philology way with close reading? Then the distant reading came out from big scale of humanities philologists like Auerbach and Curtius. But how do we balance the world literature big scale and detail of texts? And in shorter form, but in the same vein, Nuria Cordina asks, thank you so much for your commitment to world literature and your pluralistic approach to the different languages, texts, and ways of looking at the world. Since you mentioned the importance of collaborative work, what do you think is the best way to encourage cross-cultural and interdisciplinary exchange in the humanities?
So my answer to that second question is I did well. And poured a lot of time into this institute with the idea that it gives a basis for people, and nothing makes us happier, I would say, than the number of projects that have emerged. Every year, more people find people to work with. It can become ACLA seminars, it become special issues of journals. Books have been inflected by it. I really think there's really no substitute for getting together and finding a few like-minded people. I don't think myself, and Mats, of course, you will give a better the other side because you're such a great organizer of projects, and the European system rewards and expects these excellent masters and things like that. And some of them, I've done some evaluation for some of the German ones lately, and a couple of them struck me as really amazing and innovative. Others are just a kind of grab bag excuse that they have to do it to get the funding, you know. So I, in my individualistic American way, think that's not a system I'm used to, but getting a few people together to really work is quite hopeful mode of collaboration. It doesn't require millions of euros, and it can be done partly online in a way that it couldn't be done before. The world philology question, again, well, I'm arguing in my book that rather than the near native fluency in a couple of languages, it may be better to have a sliding scale of knowledge of more, as long as you are very careful in knowing what you can do with what you know and not imposing topics that you're not able to handle, or finding people to work with when you do. So I like very much, in principle, the war collectives combined in uneven development. I talk about them in the book, where they really take a broad theoretical approach. They have a working group of 7 people, and then they took just a number of novels, very carefully chosen, and they go into them in some depth. What I don't like is that they give up the philology altogether. They only work in English, even when the works, even they could read other languages, they don't. And they don't look at the original text when it's not in English at all. They don't use any of the scholarship on those other texts, whether it's Spanish or Russian. They could easily, or Arabic, at least bring somebody in to consult with them on that. They don't even do that. So it's totally doable, but it's striking that in that Anglophone post-colonial world, there's so much in the imperium of global English. They think they're anti-imperialist, except when it comes to English. So I do think these are solvable problems, and a small scale of working together, as well as the strategic awareness for your graduate students. And going for academic job market, you need to do enough work on your own to satisfy the market at that stage, but you can still do a collaborative project, a conference, article, journal, things like that. Don't have to wait forever to do it.
From Mustafa Kavruach, I remarked a conjunction between Damrosch's comparing the literatures and Puchner's The Written World, the strong commitment to draw a history of this remarkable idea of world literature across time, cultures, and geographies. And then there's an anonymous who asks if you see a similar venue being possible for world literature in order to open world literature to non-specialist audiences. Is it only a matter of leaving the space open for other languages, or also potentially encouraging new disciplinary interactions, for example, with the social sciences, as the current threat is not the only linguistic rivalries, but also the redefinition of literary studies against the exact sciences, whose methodology we are increasingly encouraged to borrow? Contemporary issues linked to the complexity of the world global order, multiple positionality versus national frameworks, double and multiple belonging versus monoglot and monocultural frameworks, calls for renewal of foci and methodologies. There's an affinity between the way that you and Martin Puchner really works across time, culture, and geographies.
Well, no, we've been teaching together a literature course that now we have rebranded the last couple of years as The Stories We Tell for General Education. So very much going to the question of, world literature, that's not going to register necessarily with a biochemistry major. The stories we tell, everybody tells stories, and we're thinking about that. When he did his book, The Written World, it was interesting. He was really starting to work in a number of texts, and he started taking it around, and editors were saying, well, people aren't actually interested in the history of literature. Can't you figure out a better way to talk about it? So he recast the book as about histories of technology and interaction between literature and writing systems and technologies, and it's been a huge success. It's been translated into a dozen languages or something. Also because it's very personal, very engaging, and something that I'm a real believer in is that what we do is a form of writing. It's not just extruding some thought. It's actually the texture of writing really, really matters. And I think that every theorist I know that I think is really influential is a really great writer, whether it's Northrop Frye, Roland Barthes, Foucault, even Lacan in his perverse way is an incredibly compelling writer. And I think we all need to think more seriously about also how we train students as actual writers, not just to know some bodies of text or know some theories. And this is very much more than ever the case, because we can't just assume we get a captive audience. We need to reach out to the wider world. So like I'm doing right now, this blog thing that will ultimately be a book for Penguin. And it's interesting, just very quickly, for several years I agreed to do it, but I didn't know how to do it. Oh, that's one book after another, so what? But then when the pandemic hit, I thought, all right, this is it. So Around the World in 80 Books, while we're just stuck, a little bit like our virtual session right now, and just thinking in 1,500 words per book, how am I going to interest people and say something interesting and make them want to read it? But even if they don't have time, they're not going to read all 80 books. It should be a reading experience, this 1,500 words. And it's a really interesting discipline. It's not the scale that we're used to teaching of an academic article or even a term paper. It's, it's 5 pages in TypeScript. Can you actually do it? And I found I wanted to get it shorter. I can't. I need 1,500 words, but I don't need more. And so if I give myself that, if it's 1,800 words, I'll find I can get 300 words out. And I just think that that's something that's exciting and fun, and we all have to do more with our writing, just to think, all right, I think I can hold your attention for 1,500 words if you're not a professional. Let me figure out how to do that. Then finally, with the discipline.
Yeah, and I just need to mention that there was Françoise Kral, I couldn't see it from the question originally, who posed this question, and also wants to mention that she really appreciates the way that the world literature discourse challenges the hegemony of English.
And we work within English as a convenient transit medium and so on. So we have to push back, which is why, getting people to read more. And I should just say very, very quickly, it was my Egyptology teacher who made me think I could read Italian. I was like an undergraduate, and he said, look at this article. I said, I'm sorry, I don't read Italian. I said, you read French, don't you? Look. And he starts showing me it's not that hard to read a scholarly article. Like, wow. So the Egyptologists took for granted reading a number of languages beyond what comparatives at that time would do. So that this I think absolutely the interdisciplinary and connection, particularly I think sociology is very important for us these days, and political science, economics. We need to connect these other disciplines, and also especially it strikes me that we're half a century behind thinking more about film, new media, the internet, and a number of our participants are already doing this. Thank goodness. We need to do a lot more of that. I should say with this Around the World blog, the real-time feedback that I get is amazing, and it's already now being translated to 7 and 8 language just by people saying, "Oh, they want to do this." This does not happen with the University Press book. So I think the world is open for comparative and world studies all around the world.
Well, on a very positive note, struck by David when he said that the world is open for comparative and world literature studies, I really wish to extend thanks to all of you for this enriching experience. Thanks most of all to David, to Mats, to Delia, and Baidik, but also to all of you who joined us today in this conversation.